At the family barbecue, my 10-year-old son asked for a simple burger. My brother laughed in his face, snatched the plate away, and told him those were only for kids with a future. The whole patio full of their elite friends nodded in agreement, while my mother told me to stop raising such a sensitive child. I did not scream or throw a fit. I quietly took our plates, threw them in the trash, and walked away. At 12:05 p.m., my brother texted me telling me to remember my place and never come back until we learned some respect. What he did not know was that the luxury lake estate he claimed to have rented for this high society gathering to impress his investors was legally owned by my holding company. And I was about to serve them all a 24-hour eviction notice, setting off a chain reaction that would bankrupt him and shatter my family perfect facade forever. Before I share exactly how I dismantled their lives piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to burn down a toxic family dynamic to protect your peace. The smoke from the grill carried the scent of expensive mesquite and privilege across the sprawling patio of the Hamptons-style lake house. Waitstaff in crisp white shirts circulated with trays of champagne, while a jazz trio played softly near the infinity pool. My brother Jamal stood at the center of it all, holding court by the massive outdoor kitchen. He was flipping thick cuts of meat while his country club friends hung onto his every word. At 38, Jamal was the picture of hedge fund arrogance, wearing a linen shirt unbuttoned just enough to show off a gold chain that probably cost more than my first car. I stood a few feet away, watching my 10-year-old son Trey walk up to his uncle. Trey is brilliant. He sees the world in vibrant colors and complex patterns, translating his ADHD into breathtaking digital art on his tablet. But in this family, his neurodivergence was treated like an embarrassing disease rather than the gift it truly was. Trey held out his paper plate. "Uncle Jamal, can I have a burger, please?" he asked politely, his eyes fixed on the sizzling Wagyu beef. Jamal paused mid-laugh with his investor buddies. He looked down at Trey, then literally yanked the serving platter out of my son's reach. He chuckled a sound that made my blood run cold. "Those are only for kids with a future, Trey. Go find some hot dogs inside." The group of men in pastel shorts erupted into laughter as if my son was the punchline to a private joke. Before I could even take a step forward, my sister-in-law Lauren chimed in. Lauren stood by the outdoor bar, swirling an oversized glass of rose. She was white entitled and perpetually obsessed with maintaining her proximity to wealth and status. "Maybe if you focused on basic math instead of doodling on that screen all day, you could earn a prime cut," she sneered, her voice dripping with that specific brand of coded condescension she always reserved for my son. "You need to understand the value of hard work, sweetie." I watched this happen, feeling the familiar weight of being the family scapegoat pressing down on my chest. It had always been this way. Jamal was the golden child, the Ivy League prodigy, whose tuition had completely drained our parents' savings. He was the one destined for greatness, while I was the cautionary tale. They had kicked me out of the house at 25 when I got pregnant with Trey, telling me I had ruined my life and shamed our family name in front of their elite social circles. They thought I was still scraping by as a mid-level dispatcher at a shipping warehouse somewhere. They had no idea that over the past decade, I had quietly built a national supply chain logistics firm from the ground up, making me a silent millionaire many times over, while Jamal lived entirely on extended credit and false bravado. I turned my gaze to my parents Winston and Vivian sitting in their plush lounge chairs under a massive cabana umbrella. I expected just a fraction of defensive instinct from them. Just one word to protect their 10-year-old grandson from being humiliated in front of 50 strangers. Instead, my mother Vivian casually adjusted her wide-brimmed sun hat and took a delicate sip of her mimosa. "Jamal is just joking, Jada," she said, rolling her eyes as if I were the one causing a problem. "Stop raising the boy to be so sensitive. He needs tough skin if he is ever going to amount to anything in this world." My father Winston did not even look up from his conversation with the local politicians, simply nodding in agreement with my mother. They expected me to react emotionally. They wanted me to cry, to yell, to fulfill the angry, loud stereotype they so desperately tried to distance their elite family from. They wanted the satisfaction of calling me unstable and kicking me out. I refused to give them that power. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the icy calm of a CEO taking over a hostile boardroom wash through my veins. I walked over to Trey, who was staring at the ground, his small shoulders slumped, his eyes welling with tears. I gently took the empty paper plate from his trembling hands. I did not look at Jamal. I did not look at Lauren. I walked past the grill, dropped the plate into the stainless steel trash can, and placed my hand on the back of my son's neck. "Come on, baby," I said softly, keeping my voice completely steady. "We are leaving." I guided him through the crowd of whispering guests, walking with my head held high. I did not storm out. I glided out, leaving them absolutely nothing to criticize. Once we were inside my SUV, with the doors locked and the tinted windows shielding us from their view, Trey finally let the tears fall. "Mom, why do they hate me so much?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why am I always doing everything wrong?" I turned off the engine and unbuckled my seatbelt, pulling my beautiful, brilliant boy into a fierce hug. "Listen to me, Trey," I said fiercely, looking directly into his tear-filled eyes. "You are doing absolutely nothing wrong. Your brain works faster and more beautifully than anyone standing on that patio. Your art is incredible. The way you see the world is a gift, a superpower that people like your Uncle Jamal could never comprehend because all they see are price tags and status. They do not hate you, baby. They are intimidated by anything they cannot put in a neat little box. You are going to do amazing things, and you will never ever let small-minded people make you feel like you do not have a future. Do you understand me?" He sniffled, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, and nodded. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too," I said, kissing his forehead. I pulled out of the long sweeping driveway of the estate, putting the Hamptons-style mansion in my rearview mirror. We hit the highway, the tires humming a steady rhythm against the asphalt as I headed back toward the city. The tension in my shoulders began to release, replaced by a sharp, calculating clarity. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. The clock on the dashboard read exactly 12:05 p.m. It was a text message from Jamal. I asked the car voice assistant to read it aloud over the speakers. "Remember your place, Jada? But now he is crying for nothing. Do not come back until you both learn some respect." I did not reply. I did not block him. I simply let a cold smirk spread across my face as the GPS navigated us toward the city. Jamal thought he held all the cards. He had spent the entire weekend bragging to his wealthy investors about how he had dropped $20,000 to rent this exclusive lake estate out of his own pocket to host this lavish weekend barbecue. He thought he was untouchable. What he absolutely did not know was that the estate he was currently standing on was owned by Apex Holdings LLC, an asset management company I had created 3 years ago to diversify my logistics wealth. Jamal was renting my house, and I knew for a fact, because my property manager had flagged it on Friday, that Jamal's credit card for the exorbitant security deposit had bounced that very morning. He was technically in default and occupying my property illegally. I picked up my phone and hit speed dial number 4. David, my asset manager, answered on the second ring. "David," I said, my voice smooth and devoid of any familial hesitation. "The current tenant at the lake house is in breach of contract regarding the security deposit. Execute an immediate zero-tolerance eviction. Call the local sheriffs and have them removed from the premises right now." The ringing tone of the Bluetooth system echoed through the quiet leather interior of my SUV. I kept my eyes on the winding road leading away from the lake, taking deep, measured breaths. In the back seat, Trey was quiet, his fingers flying across his digital drawing tablet. The chaos of the barbecue, the smoke, the laughter, and the cruelty were miles behind us now. David answered on the second ring. His voice was crisp and professional, a sharp contrast to the loud arrogance I had just left behind. "Good afternoon, Jada," he said. "I assume you are calling about the lake property." David was my lead asset manager. 3 years ago, when my logistics firm started generating massive surplus revenue, I created Apex Holdings, LLC, to quietly acquire luxury real estate. I wanted hard assets, untouchable wealth that did not rely on the fluctuating markets my brother so desperately gambled in. The sprawling Hamptons-style estate we had just left was the crown jewel of that portfolio. I bought it as a distressed property and poured $2 million into renovations, turning it into an exclusive corporate rental. I never put my name on the public deeds. I preferred the power of invisibility. "Yes, David," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. "I need a status update on the current tenant." Jamal had been bragging all month about this weekend. He had sent out embossed invitations to his hedge fund investors, boasting about dropping $20,000 to secure the most elite property on the lake. He wanted to project an image of absolute financial dominance. He wanted his investors to look at the manicured lawns, the infinity pool, and the private dock, and see a man who turned everything he touched into gold. He had absolutely no idea that the luxury estate he was using to build his house of cards was legally owned by the very sister he treated like garbage. "Well," David began, the sound of a keyboard clacking in the background. "That is exactly why I flagged his file this morning. Mr. Jamal Davis is currently in default." I glanced at the digital clock on the dashboard. It was just past noon. "Default," I repeated. "Clarify. The initial booking fee cleared 2 weeks ago," David explained. "But the $10,000 security deposit and the catering retainer were scheduled to process at 8 this morning. We attempted to run the platinum card he kept on file. It was declined. We tried a secondary corporate card he provided. That one bounced as well. I reached out to his office, but his assistant informed me he was unreachable for the weekend. As it stands, he is occupying the property in direct violation of the rental agreement." A cold wave of satisfaction washed over me. Jamal was drowning. He was putting on a millionaire facade while floating on maxed-out credit lines that were finally snapping. He had just humiliated my son over a piece of meat, claiming Trey had no future, while his own present was entirely funded by debt. He was standing on my grass, breathing my air, and insulting my child while his bank accounts hit zero. "What is standard protocol for a breach of contract on a high-tier property?" David, I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Typically, we offer a 24-hour grace period if the client communicates a banking error." David replied, his tone strictly business. "However, given that he is unresponsive and the property contains highly valuable assets, our zero-tolerance policy allows for immediate eviction. We have the legal right to terminate the stay and remove the occupants. But since he is your brother, I wanted to get your direct authorization before making the call." There was a time when I would have hesitated, a time when the ingrained expectation of family loyalty would have forced me to cover his debt, to protect my parents from embarrassment, to swallow my pride, and shrink myself to keep their perfect world intact. But that time had ended the moment Jamal ripped a plate out of my 10-year-old son's hands. He had drawn the line. I was simply enforcing it. "He is not my brother right now, David," I said, my voice dropping to a temperature that left no room for debate. "He is a defaulting tenant who has breached his contract. I want you to execute the eviction immediately. Do not call his phone. Do not give him a warning. Call the local sheriff's department and request an escort for trespassing. Have the property manager on site within the hour. I want them off my property today." "Understood," David said without missing a beat. "I will dispatch the local authorities immediately and lock down the smart home systems. The gates will be secured once they exit." "Is there anything else?" "No." "David," I replied, a genuine smile finally touching my lips. "That will be all. Have a wonderful weekend." I ended the call, and the cabin of the SUV fell silent again. The trees blurred past the windows as we merged onto the main interstate heading back to the city. My heart was beating with a steady, powerful rhythm. I had not yelled or screamed. I had not caused a scene that my mother could weaponize against me. I had simply exercised my legal rights as a property owner. Jamal wanted to talk about knowing my place. My place was at the top of the food chain, holding the deed to his fake reality. I adjusted the rear-view mirror so I could see Trey. He was still looking down at his tablet, his small shoulders tense, expecting the rest of the day to be ruined. He was so used to our family making him feel like an inconvenience, a burden that did not deserve the good things in life. I was going to change that narrative right now. "Trey," I called out softly. He looked up, his large brown eyes meeting mine in the mirror. "Yes, Mom." I smiled at him, letting all the warmth and fierce love I possessed fill my voice. "I am sorry about the barbecue, honey, but to be honest, those burgers looked overcooked anyway." Trey gave a small, hesitant half smile. "It is okay. I was not that hungry." "Well, I am," I told him, turning the steering wheel to take the exit toward the upscale downtown district. "So forget the burgers. We are going to that place with the velvet booths and the chandeliers. We are getting the biggest, best tomahawk steak in the entire city, and you can order whatever dessert you want." Trey's eyes widened, the sadness instantly evaporating, replaced by genuine shock. "Really, the fancy place?" "Really, I promised. Because you deserve the absolute best, Trey. And do not ever let anyone tell you otherwise." As he cheered from the back seat, I focused on the road ahead. I was going to treat my son like royalty, and while we were sitting in a luxury steakhouse being treated with the respect we deserved, Jamal and his elite friends were about to have a very different kind of afternoon. The dominoes had officially started to fall. The ambiance inside the prime steakhouse was a world away from the suffocating humidity and toxic whispers of the lake house. Here the lighting was low and warm, casting a golden hue over heavy mahogany tables and deep leather booths. The only sounds were the soft clinking of crystal glasses and the low murmur of respectful conversations. I watched as a white-coated waiter placed a massive, sizzling tomahawk steak right in the center of our table. The bone was perfectly Frenched, the meat seared to an absolute masterpiece. Trey stared at it with wide eyes, completely forgetting the paper plate of rejection from an hour ago. While we ate, I asked him to pass me his iPad. He hesitated for a second, a defensive reflex learned from a family that constantly told him to put his toys away and act normal. But he slid the device across the smooth wood. I looked at the screen and felt a surge of fierce, protective pride. He had not just been doodling in the car. He had been designing a complex, three-dimensional rendering of a futuristic cityscape. The attention to detail was staggering. He had mapped out the light sources, the structural geometry, and the vibrant neon colors contrasting against deep, deliberate shadows. It was the work of a prodigy, not a nuisance. "Trey, this is incredible," I said, tracing my finger just above the digital canvas. "You did this on the highway." He nodded, chewing a piece of steak. "Uncle Jamal said I need to focus on basic math. Aunt Lauren said my brain is broken because I cannot sit still in class. She said kids like me do not get to eat prime beef." I set the iPad down and leaned across the table, making sure I had his complete, undivided attention. "Listen to me very carefully, Trey. Your Uncle Jamal is a fool. Your Aunt Lauren is a bitter woman who only cares about what other people think. Your brain is not broken. You have ADHD, and do you know what that actually means? It means your brain is like a high-performance sports car. It processes information faster than everyone else around you. It sees colors and patterns and possibilities that ordinary people are completely blind to. What they call a distraction is actually your greatest superpower." I watched his posture slowly begin to change. When they look at a building, they just see bricks. I continued, my voice firm and unwavering. "When you look at a building, you see the entire architectural blueprint. You see the art. Never let people with ordinary minds convince you that your extraordinary mind is a flaw. Do you understand me?" The heavy defensive slump he had carried all weekend finally melted away. He sat up straighter, cutting into his steak with renewed energy. A genuine smile broke across his face. He was safe here. He was valued. He was eating the best meal in the city while the people who insulted him were eating lies. Just as the waiter approached to hand us the dessert menu, my phone sitting face down next to my sparkling water began to vibrate. I ignored it. 10 seconds later, it vibrated again and again. A relentless, frantic buzzing that rattled against the heavy mahogany table. I casually flipped the screen over. The notification center was a waterfall of panic. 5 missed calls from Jamal, 3 from my mother, 2 from my father. Now a fresh incoming call from Vivian flashed across the glass. I let it ring. "Is that Grandma?" Trey asked, noticing the rapid succession of alerts lighting up my screen. "Are they mad that we left without saying goodbye?" I smiled, taking a slow sip of my water. "They are just realizing that we are gone, honey. Go ahead and pick out whatever dessert you want. Get the double chocolate cake." The phone finally stopped ringing, replaced by the small red icon indicating a new voicemail. I waited until the waiter cleared our main plates and Trey was completely engrossed in his massive slice of chocolate cake before I picked up the device. I pressed the speaker to my ear, keeping the volume low. The sound that greeted me was absolute music to my ears. My mother, Vivian, had spent her entire adult life cultivating a voice of smooth, elite perfection. She spoke with a practiced cadence specifically designed for country club luncheons and high society charity galas. But the voice echoing through the receiver right now was shrill, breathless, and teetering on the edge of a total meltdown. "Jada, pick up the phone right now!" Vivian screamed, her composure entirely shattered. "It is an absolute disaster over here. We are being completely humiliated. The local sheriff just pulled up with 2 squad cars and their lights flashing. They are forcing us to pack our bags and leave, right in front of the Harrisons and the DuPonts. The officers are claiming Jamal's credit card bounced and that he is committing payment fraud. They are treating us like common criminals, Jada." I held the phone closer to my ear, soaking in the glorious, chaotic background noise. The audio painted a perfect picture of their ruin. Jamal's voice was echoing in the distance, screaming at a deeply indifferent police officer about knowing the mayor and having powerful lawyers. Over his shouting, I could hear Lauren audibly sobbing, shrieking about her designer luggage being set down on the wet, muddy grass. Vivian's voice returned to the microphone, frantic and completely unhinged. "Jamal is trying to fix it, but the property manager will not even listen to him. They are threatening to arrest him for trespassing if we are not off the property in 20 minutes. All our guests are driving away. They are looking at us like we are trash. Call me back immediately. We need you to wire us cash for hotel rooms. This is the worst day of my life." The voicemail clicked off. I lowered the phone and set it gently back on the table. The worst day of her life so far, I thought to myself. They had spent years kicking me down, propping Jamal up as the undisputed financial genius of the family. They had allowed him to insult my son, pull food away from a child, and treat us like peasants begging for scraps. Now the illusion was violently shattered. The golden boy was being escorted off a luxury property in the back of a police cruiser, in front of the very high society friends my parents worshipped. I looked across the table at my son, who was happily digging into his dessert, completely oblivious to the absolute chaos consuming the people who had mocked him just an hour ago. I signaled the waiter for the check, feeling lighter and more powerful than I had in a decade. The eviction was just the opening move. Tomorrow morning, they were going to learn exactly who they had been messing with. The waiter cleared our plates and set the heavy leather check folder on the table. I slipped my black titanium corporate card inside without a second thought. Trey was happily sketching a new cityscape on his tablet, his face smeared with just a bit of double chocolate frosting. For the first time all weekend, his shoulders were relaxed and his breathing was even. He looked completely at peace. I signed the receipt, added a generous 30% tip, and took a slow, satisfying sip of my sparkling water. The calm in our quiet velvet booth was absolute. But I knew the situation 30 miles away at the lake house was anything but peaceful. I pulled my iPad from my leather tote and tapped the secure application for Apex Holdings. The system authenticated my face, and a grid of high-definition security camera feeds loaded instantly onto the screen. I tapped the display, expanding the exterior feeds for the estate. The 4K resolution was crystal clear, capturing every glorious, chaotic detail of the eviction currently unfolding on my property. 2 local sheriff cruisers were parked at aggressive angles across the immaculate circular driveway, their red and blue lights flashing brightly in the afternoon sun. 4 deputies stood like immovable brick walls on the manicured lawn holding clipboards and pointing firmly toward the massive wrought iron gates. And right in the middle of the flashing lights and uniform presence was my family experiencing the exact reality check they had so desperately needed for the last 10 years. I zoomed in on camera 3, which covered the main entrance. Jamal was pacing frantically on the cobblestone walkway. He was no longer the smooth, arrogant hedge fund manager who had been holding court by the grill just an hour ago. His expensive linen shirt was untucked, his sunglasses were shoved haphazardly onto his forehead, and he was waving his arms aggressively at the lead deputy. I could not hear the audio, but his body language screamed of toxic entitlement, hitting an absolute brick wall. He was pointing at the house, pointing at his phone, and puffing out his chest. The deputy simply tapped his clipboard, shook his head, and pointed his pen directly at the road, refusing to engage in the negotiation. Jamal was completely powerless. His money was fake, his status was a lie, and the law did not care about his fabricated hedge fund persona. Then the camera caught Lauren. I actually had to suppress a laugh in the middle of the steakhouse. She was struggling to drag 2 massive Louis Vuitton suitcases across the damp grass because the police cruisers were blocking her path to their luxury leased SUV. In her frantic panic to get away from the flashing lights, she tripped over a raised sprinkler head. I watched with deep, profound satisfaction as she stumbled forward, dropping the expensive luggage straight into a puddle of thick brown mud formed by the caterers draining the ice coolers. Her pristine white country club outfit was instantly ruined, splashed with dark, wet soil. She stood up, stamping her feet in her muddy designer heels, and started screaming at Jamal. Jamal completely ignored his wife continuing his futile, unhinged argument with the sheriff. I switched to camera 4, angling the view toward the outdoor cabana area. This was the view I really wanted to see. My parents, Winston and Vivian, were standing by the edge of the driveway, completely frozen in shock. My mother had dedicated her entire existence to cultivating a flawless, untouchable image. For 30 years, she had clawed her way up the social ladder, obsessing over her status in elite Jack and Jill social circles, hosting expensive charity galas, and looking down on anyone she deemed beneath her tax bracket. She had built her entire identity on being better than everyone else, on maintaining a perfect aristocratic facade. Now she was standing in the middle of a police raid. I watched as her wealthy friends, the high society investors and socialites Jamal had brought up here to impress, scrambled to their luxury vehicles in absolute terror. These were people who despised public scenes and avoided legal trouble like the plague. They were throwing their golf clubs and overnight bags into their trunks, completely ignoring my parents. Winston reached out to shake hands with a prominent local politician he had been trying to court for months, but the man simply shook his head, got into his silver Mercedes, and sped down the driveway without a backward glance. The absolute devastation on my father's face was palpable even through the digital screen. He looked older, smaller, and entirely stripped of his pride. My mother was literally hiding her face behind her oversized sun hat, trying to shield herself from the judging stares of the catering staff who were hastily packing up the luxury barbecue spread. This was their ultimate nightmare unfolding in broad daylight. They could handle financial ruin, as long as it was kept a dark family secret. But public humiliation in front of their elite peers, being treated like common squatters in front of the exact people they wanted to impress, was a fate worse than death. They had sacrificed my mental health for decades. They had allowed my 10-year-old son to be mocked and degraded just to protect this fragile, fake image of Jamal absolute superiority. They had called me a failure and told me to remember my place. Now they were watching their carefully curated kingdom burn to the ground in real time, and I was the one holding the match. I watched as the deputies finally forced Jamal to step off the cobblestone and walk toward his car. The physical defeat in his posture was the exact validation I needed. Just as I watched Lauren shove her muddy suitcases into the trunk, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against the steakhouse table. It was an unknown local number. Jamal had obviously realized his primary line had been suspended due to the cascading failure of his credit accounts. He was calling from a prepaid burner phone. I picked up the phone, keeping my eyes glued to the iPad screen as his car finally pulled out of my gates. I pressed accept and raised the phone to my ear. Without saying a word, I waited to hear the sound of his desperation. The short drive from the steakhouse back to our city penthouse was peaceful. Trey was in high spirits, humming quietly to himself as he tapped away on his screen. The heavy, oppressive fog that always accompanied family events had completely lifted from his shoulders. I gripped the leather steering wheel, feeling a profound sense of clarity. For a decade, I had allowed my parents and my brother to dictate the terms of my worth. I had operated in the shadows, building an empire while letting them believe I was a failure, because the alternative, dealing with their greed and entitlement, seemed too exhausting. But today the dynamic had permanently shifted. They had drawn first blood by humiliating my son. I was simply finishing the war they started. When we walked into our penthouse, the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the downtown skyline. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a fiery orange glow over the glass and steel towers. Trey headed straight for the kitchen to grab a juice box, while I walked into my home office, setting my purse down on the sleek glass desk. My phone remained silent. I had blocked Jamal's burner number the moment I hung up on Vivian. They were likely scrambling to find a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, their platinum cards useless plastic, their elite status completely incinerated. I opened my laptop and checked the digital logs for Apex Holdings. David had already uploaded the eviction summary. The local sheriffs had escorted Jamal Loren and my parents off the premises without major incident, though the report noted extreme verbal hostility from the tenant. The property manager had secured the gates and changed the smart lock codes. The estate was safe, Jamal was out, and the security deposit he had tried to float on a bounced card was now officially a matter for the collection agencies. I slept incredibly well that night. There were no lingering doubts, no guilt over turning my back on my blood. Vivian's threat to ruin my life had severed the final thread of familial obligation. A mother who would actively try to destroy her daughter's career to protect her son's ego was not a mother worth agonizing over. Monday morning arrived with crisp, bright efficiency. I dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, slipping on a pair of stiletto heels that echoed sharply against the marble floors of my penthouse. I dropped Trey off at his specialized private academy, a school that actually nurtured his neurodivergent brilliance rather than punishing him for it. I kissed his forehead, told him I loved him, and watched him walk through the double doors with his head held high. By 7:45, I was stepping out of the private elevator onto the top floor of Jada Logistics, Inc. The reception area was a symphony of sleek, minimalist design with the company logo frosted onto the glass walls. My assistant Chloe looked up from her desk, holding a steaming cup of black coffee. "Good morning, Jada," she said, handing me the cup. "The quarterly supply chain reports are on your desk, and the regional managers are ready for the 10 o'clock briefing." "Thank you, Chloe," I said, taking a sip of the perfect coffee. "Also, I am expecting a very specific personal call on my direct executive line this morning. It might come through the main switchboard first. If a woman named Vivian Davis calls claiming she needs to speak to the warehouse manager or the supervisor in charge of Jada Davis, route her directly to my office. Do not screen her. Do not ask for details. Just put her through." Chloe raised an eyebrow, her professional demeanor slipping for just a fraction of a second. "The warehouse manager. Jada, you own the entire national network. We do not even have a single warehouse manager at this corporate location." "I know." I smiled, a cold, razor-sharp grin. "But the caller does not know that. Just patch her through, Chloe. It is crucial." "Understood?" Chloe nodded, turning back to her multi-line phone system. I walked into my massive corner office, closing the heavy oak door behind me. The room was expansive, surrounded by glass that looked out over the bustling city center. My desk was a massive slab of polished walnut positioned perfectly to command the room. I sat down in my leather executive chair, booted up my dual monitors, and waited. I did not have to wait long. At exactly 8:05, the red light on my direct office line began to flash. Chloe had patched her through. Vivian was incredibly punctual when she was on a mission to destroy someone. I took a deep breath, savoring the absolute absurdity of the moment. I leaned forward and pressed the speaker button. Jada Logistics Executive Office, I said, deepening my voice just slightly to project the generic tone of a busy corporate manager. How can I help you? The voice that came through the speaker was dripping with venomous authority. Yes, good morning. I need to speak to the supervisor in charge of dispatch, specifically the manager responsible for an employee named Jada Davis. This is an urgent matter regarding her employment. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers together. You are speaking to the head of this office, Mum. What seems to be the issue with Jada Davis? Vivian let out a dramatic, heavy sigh, performing her role as the deeply concerned but socially responsible citizen. I am calling because it is my moral duty to inform you of the kind of person you have working on your payroll. I am Jada Mother. And it breaks my heart to say this, but she is completely unstable. She is currently experiencing a severe mental breakdown, and she poses a massive liability to your company operations. Is that right? I replied, keeping my voice completely neutral. A liability, you say? A massive one, Vivian insisted, her voice rising with dramatic flair. She is lashing out at her family. She is exhibiting vicious, unpredictable behavior. Just this weekend, she caused a horrific scene at a private family event. She is financially reckless and emotionally unhinged. I strongly advise you to terminate her employment immediately before she damages your warehouse operations or compromises your inventory. She is simply not fit for duty. I stared at the speakerphone, letting her words hang in the quiet elegance of my executive office. She was laying it all out on the table, trying to orchestrate my ruin with the casual ease of ordering a country club lunch. Well, Mrs. Davis, I said, my voice returning to its normal cadence, dropping the generic manager persona completely. That is a fascinating performance review. But I think you are a little confused about my position in this company. The silence on the other end of the line was immediate and thick. Vivian breathed hitched. Jada. Yes, Mother, I replied, leaning closer to the microphone. It is Jada, and you are not talking to a warehouse manager. You are talking to the chief executive officer. What? Vivian stammered, the venom suddenly replaced by absolute confusion. What are you talking about? I called the supervisor number. I dialed the corporate headquarters. You dialed the executive boardroom. Mother, I corrected smoothly. You dialed the direct line to the owner of Jada Logistics, Inc. I do not work on a loading dock. I own the loading docks. I own the national supply chain. I own the fleet of trucks running up and down the eastern seaboard. I built a multi-million-dollar empire while you and Dad were busy throwing money into Jamal's sinking ship. That is impossible, Vivian gasped, her voice trembling. You are a dispatcher. You got pregnant and ruined your life. You do not have that kind of money. I have exactly that kind of money. I said, my tone dropping to a lethal calm. In fact, I have enough money to diversify my assets. I have enough money to create a quiet little real estate management firm called Apex Holdings, LLC. The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line told me the exact second the final puzzle piece clicked into place in her mind. That is right, Mother. I continued, twisting the knife with absolute precision. Jamal did not get evicted due to a bank glitch. He got evicted because his credit card bounced on a property owned by my holding company. You were standing on my grass. You were admiring my infinity pool. And you were kicked out by my property manager. Vivian was completely speechless. I could hear the faint sound of traffic in her background, meaning she was likely sitting in a cheap motel parking lot, trying to process the fact that the daughter she had treated like dirt was actually the kingmaker of the family. You threatened to ruin my life, I said, my voice echoing off the glass walls of my office. You threatened to make me homeless because I would not cover Jamal's debt. You showed me exactly who you are. So let me make this very clear. Jamal is bankrupt. His fake hedge fund is collapsing, and I have the lawyers on standby to collect the $10,000 cancellation fee he owes my property management firm. You chose your golden child. Now you get to live in his reality. Jada, please, Vivian. Finally choked out, her voice small and broken, stripped of all its elite arrogance. You cannot do this. We have nothing. Jamal accounts are completely locked. We are in a motel. "Remember your place, Mother," I said, quoting the exact text Jamal had sent me just 24 hours ago. "And do not ever call my office again." I hit the button disconnecting the line. The office was quiet once again. I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the empire I had built with my own 2 hands. The toxic weight of my family had finally been completely severed. I was free. I turned back to my desk, opened the quarterly reports, and got to work. Jada, are you there?" Jamal's voice was unrecognizable. It wasn't the smooth, booming baritone he used to charm venture capitalists and country club presidents. It was the high-pitched, reedy sound of a man standing on the very edge of a cliff, watching the ground crumble beneath his expensive loafers. I didn't answer immediately. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, watching Trey happily scrape the last of the double chocolate frosting off his plate in the quiet elegance of our velvet booth. The contrast between my serene reality and Jamal's panicked breathing was nothing short of poetic. "I am here, Jamal," I said, my voice perfectly level. "Though I am surprised you found the time to call. You seemed quite busy getting escorted off the premises." "How do you know about that?" He snapped, his breathing erratic. "Never mind. Listen to me. My main card got flagged for suspicious activity. It is a completely ridiculous bank error, but they locked my accounts and suspended my phone line as a fraud prevention measure. I had to borrow a caterer's burner phone just to call you." A bank error. The delusion was staggering. He was facing total financial collapse, his credit cards bouncing like rubber balls, and his mind had immediately constructed a fantasy where he was the victim of a minor administrative glitch. "That sounds stressful," I replied, my tone devoid of a single ounce of sympathy. "It is a nightmare," he shouted, the background noise bleeding through the receiver. I could hear the crunch of gravel and Lauren's shrill voice arguing with someone. "And it is exactly why I told you to leave your bad energy ruined the entire weekend. You brought this toxic, negative vibe, and the second you drove away, everything started going wrong. This is your fault, Jada. You cursed this weekend." I actually had to pull the phone away from my ear for a moment, genuinely stunned by the sheer magnitude of his narcissism. He was blaming his bounced checks and fraudulent credit lines on my bad energy. It was the ultimate scapegoat tactic. Whenever Jamal failed, it was always someone else's fault. If he lost a client, the market was rigged. If he crashed a car, the road was slick. If he went bankrupt, it was his sister's bad vibes. "My bad energy caused your platinum card to decline," I asked, my voice dripping with icy amusement. "My bad vibes prompted the sheriff to serve you with an eviction notice for trespassing and payment fraud." "It is a glitch," he roared, his voice cracking. "I am a multimillionaire, Jada. I manage 8-figure portfolios. Do you think I can't afford a weekend rental? The bank screwed up, and now the property manager is being an absolute psycho. They literally threw our luggage into the mud. Lauren is having a panic attack. Mom is hyperventilating, and half of my investors just drove off in disgust." "Well," I said smoothly, "I suppose prime cuts of meat and luxury estates are only for people with an actual future, Jamal. Go find a cheap motel." "Listen to me, you spiteful." He caught himself taking a ragged breath, trying to force his tone into something resembling a negotiation. "I need cash, right now. The banks won't open until Monday morning, and I cannot leave Mom and Dad stranded on the side of the road like homeless people. I need you to wire $5,000 to Lauren's debit account immediately. It will cover emergency suites at the Four Seasons for us and the parents until I sort this mess out tomorrow." $5,000. He was demanding a bailout wrapped in an insult delivered with the absolute arrogance of a king ordering a peasant. "No," I said simply. "What do you mean, no?" He demanded, the panic flaring back up. "I am not asking for a handout, Jada. It is a bridge loan for 24 hours. I will pay you back with interest. You owe this to the family. You cannot just leave Mom and Dad out here." "I didn't leave Mom and Dad out there," I reminded him. "You did. You rented a property you couldn't pay for. You invited guests you couldn't afford to entertain. You wrote checks your ego couldn't cash. This is the reality of the life you built, Jamal. I am not financing your delusions for another second." "You miserable ungrateful!" Jamal started to scream, but there was a sudden scuffle on the other end of the line. The phone fumbled, the sound of fabric rustling and heavy breathing filling the speaker. When the next voice came through, it wasn't Jamal's. It was my mother's. Jada. Vivian spat, her voice trembling with absolute fury. You listen to me, and you listen to me right now. Hello, Mother. Are you enjoying the fresh air? You are a disgrace to this family, she screamed, abandoning all pretense of her refined country club persona. The mask had completely melted away, revealing the bitter, venomous woman underneath. Your brother is a financial genius. He is a pillar of this community. He is experiencing a minor banking error. And instead of helping your family in a moment of crisis, you are being a selfish, vindictive little brat. A minor banking error doesn't end in a police escort, Mother, I said, keeping my voice low and steady so as not to disturb the other patrons in the restaurant. He is broke. He has been broke for years. He has been living on extended credit and your retirement funds to maintain an illusion. I am just the only one refusing to applaud the magic trick. How dare you speak about him that way? Vivian shrieked. Jamal is going to be a titan in this industry. He made a simple logistical mistake. But you are nothing. You have always been nothing but a jealous, bitter disappointment. You couldn't handle seeing your brother succeed, so you ran away like a coward today and brought this horrible karma down on our heads. The mental gymnastics required to blame me for a police raid I wasn't even present for was truly Olympic level. For 35 years, she had protected Jamal from the consequences of his own actions. She had enabled his arrogance, funded his failures, and used me as a convenient punching bag to absorb all the family's dysfunction. Are you finished? I asked coldly. No, I am not finished. Vivian raged, her breath coming in ragged gasps. If you do not wire that money to Lauren right this second, you are dead to us. Do you hear me, dead? And I promise you, Jada, I will make you pay for this humiliation. I know exactly how much you need your little warehouse job to support that defective son of yours. My blood turned to absolute ice. The mention of Trey, the casual, vicious cruelty of calling my brilliant child defective, ignited a fire in my chest that burned away the last microscopic trace of daughterly obligation I had left. What did you just say? My voice was a deadly, quiet whisper. You heard me, she sneered, mistaking my quiet rage for fear. You think you can disrespect us and just go back to your pathetic life. I am calling your warehouse boss tomorrow morning. First thing on Monday, I am going to tell them exactly what kind of unstable, vicious, unreliable person you are. I am going to tell them you are going through a mental breakdown. You will be fired by noon. Let's see how smug you are when you are standing in an unemployment line begging us for help. She actually thought I was still scraping by. She truly believed I was a mid-level dispatcher, clocking in and out of a dingy shipping facility, terrified of a manager's reprimand. She thought she held the power to destroy my livelihood with a single phone call. The irony was so profound, so absolutely magnificent, that I didn't even feel the need to correct her. I looked at Trey, who was showing me a digital drawing of a superhero he had just finished. He smiled at me, completely unaware of the absolute poison radiating from the phone in my hand. I smiled back at him, a genuine warm smile, before bringing the phone back to my mouth. Call them, I said softly. Excuse me. Vivian stammered, clearly thrown by my lack of panic. Call my boss tomorrow morning, Mother. In fact, I insist on it. Tell them everything you just told me. See exactly how far that gets you. Before she could utter another toxic syllable, I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red end button. I didn't block the burner number. I simply turned my phone on silent and slipped it back into my leather tote bag. The line was dead. The connection was severed, and the trap was perfectly flawlessly set. Everything okay, Mom? Trey asked, noticing the intense look on my face. Everything is perfect, baby, I said, reaching over to wipe a smudge of chocolate off his cheek. In fact, I think tomorrow is going to be the best Monday I've had in a very long time. I paid the bill, took my son's hand, and walked out of the steakhouse into the bright, clear afternoon. The weekend was over, but the real reckoning had just begun. The drive back to our city penthouse was peaceful. The heavy, oppressive fog that always accompanied family events had completely lifted from my shoulders. For a decade, I had allowed my parents and my brother to dictate the terms of my worth. I had operated in the shadows, building an empire while letting them believe I was a failure because the alternative dealing with their greed and entitlement seemed too exhausting. But today, the dynamic had permanently shifted. They had drawn first blood by humiliating my son. I was simply finishing the war they started. When we walked into our penthouse, the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the downtown skyline. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a fiery orange glow over the glass and steel towers. Trey headed straight for the kitchen to grab a juice box, while I walked into my home office, setting my purse down on the sleek glass desk. My phone remained silent. I knew they were likely scrambling to find a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, their platinum cards useless plastic, their elite status completely incinerated. I opened my laptop and checked the digital logs for Apex Holdings. David had already uploaded the eviction summary. The local sheriffs had escorted Jamal, Lauren, and my parents off the premises without major incident, though the report noted extreme verbal hostility from the tenant. The property manager had secured the gates and changed the smart lock codes. The estate was safe. Jamal was out, and the security deposit he had tried to float on a bounced card was now officially a matter for the collection agencies. I slept incredibly well that night. There were no lingering doubts, no guilt over turning my back on my blood. Vivian's threat to ruin my life had severed the final thread of familial obligation. A mother who would actively try to destroy her daughter's career to protect her son's ego was not a mother worth agonizing over. She wanted to call the supervisor of Jada Logistics, Inc. She wanted to speak to the person in charge of my employment. I could hardly wait for her phone call. I had barely set my phone face down on the polished walnut desk when the intercom buzzed. Chloe's voice broke the brief silence of my office. Jada. I have a Jamal and a Lauren on line 1. They are demanding to speak to whoever is in charge of your employment. They are insisting it is an extreme emergency regarding workplace safety and corporate liability. I leaned forward, pressing the intercom button. Put them on speaker, Chloe, and mute our end for a moment. I want to hear exactly how they pitch this. The line clicked. The sound of heavy breathing and frantic background noise filled my office. They must have been sitting in the exact same motel parking lot as Vivian, using another borrowed phone or desperately clinging to the last sliver of battery on a dying device. Lauren spoke first. Her voice was pitched in that specific breathless register designed to convey victimhood and demand immediate managerial action. Hello? Yes. Am I speaking to the head of human resources? Chloe, having stepped into my office to monitor the call, nodded at me. I gestured for her to speak. Yes, this is the Executive Human Resources Division, Chloe replied smoothly. How can I assist you today? Lauren let out a sharp, dramatic exhale. Thank God. You need to pull the file on one of your employees immediately. Her name is Jada Davis. She works in your dispatch department. I am her sister-in-law, and I am calling out of deep, profound concern for the safety of your workplace. Safety? Chloe asked, perfectly maintaining her professional tone. Yes, safety, Lauren insisted. Jada is completely unhinged. She is exhibiting highly aggressive and hostile behavior. We had a private family gathering this weekend, and she was absolutely out of control. She is volatile. She is creating a toxic environment, and frankly, she is a danger to herself and your other employees. You know how these dispatch warehouse types can get when they snap? I am telling you this as a courtesy, because she is going to cost your company thousands of dollars in liability if you do not terminate her immediately. I sat back in my leather chair, steepling my fingers. The sheer audacity of Lauren attempting to weaponize corporate HR buzzwords against me was intoxicating. She was using heavily coded language, painting me as an aggressive, unstable threat in a desperate bid to ruin my livelihood. Then Jamal grabbed the phone. His voice was laced with frantic, arrogant urgency. Listen to me. I am a high-level hedge fund manager. I know how corporate liability works. My sister is in severe financial distress. She is a single mother drowning in debt, and she is lashing out at her family because of it. She is stealing company time. She is erratic. People in her financial situation steal from their employers. They compromise inventory. They ruin the company brand. You need to walk her out of the building with security right now. Today. If you do not fire her, I will personally contact your CEO and make sure they know you ignored a direct, credible threat to their operations. Jamal was practically hyperventilating. He was projecting his entire catastrophic reality onto me. He was the one drowning in debt. He was the one who was erratic and financially compromised. But in his twisted, desperate mind, destroying my modest little warehouse job was the only way to regain a sense of control over his collapsing kingdom. Chloe looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and suppressed amusement. She hovered her finger over the mute button, waiting for my signal. I gave her a single sharp nod. "Are you quite finished, Jamal?" I asked. My voice resonated through the high-definition speakerphone, filling the quiet space of my corner office. It was calm, measured, and absolutely lethal. The line went dead silent. Not a breath. Not a rustle of fabric. Absolute suffocating silence. Jada Jamal finally choked out. The sound was barely a whisper, stripped of all the bombastic hedge fund manager bravado he had just been projecting. "Yes, Jamal," I said, leaning closer to the microphone. "It is Jada, and you are not speaking to a mid-level HR representative. You are speaking to the founder, chief executive officer, and sole owner of Jada Logistics Incorporated." I let the words hang in the air, allowing the devastating reality of his situation to crush the remaining breath from his lungs. "You called a recorded corporate line?" I continued, my tone dropping to a razor-sharp whisper. "You explicitly identified yourselves, and you proceeded to spin a highly actionable web of lies aimed at terminating my employment. As the owner of this enterprise, I am highly concerned about the legal liabilities of the defamation you just committed. I have a team of corporate litigators who handle multi-million-dollar supply chain disputes before lunch. How do you think they will handle a slam-dunk defamation and tortious interference lawsuit against a bankrupt fraudster and his aggressive wife?" Jamal let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Lauren was completely silent, presumably paralyzed by the realization that she had just threatened the CEO of a national logistics empire. "You wanted to speak to the person in charge of my employment, Lauren," I said, directing my attention to the silence on her end. "You are speaking to her. And I must say your performance review of my character was deeply lacking in factual evidence. I am not stealing company time. I own the time. I own the warehouse. I own the trucks on the highway. And as of yesterday, I own the very ground you were standing on when you got evicted." "But wait!" Jamal stammered, his brain misfiring as it tried to process the total destruction of his worldview. "But the HR department. The receptionist patched us through." "Because I told them to patch you through," I explained simply. "I knew exactly what you would do. I knew the moment your fake wealth evaporated, you would try to drag me down to make yourself feel taller. You are so predictable, Jamal. You always have been. You built an entire life on sand, and now the tide has come in." There was a sharp click. The line went dead. Jamal had hung up completely, unable to face the reality of his own destruction. I sat back in my chair, letting out a long, slow breath. The silence in the office was sweet and victorious. Chloe stood by the console, shaking her head in sheer disbelief. "I have handled hostile vendor negotiations and aggressive union disputes," Chloe said, her voice laced with awe. "But I have never heard anything quite like that. Do you actually want legal to draft a cease and desist?" I waved my hand dismissively. "No. They have nothing left to take. Let them rot in whatever cheap motel they manage to find. They are officially out of my life." Chloe smiled, gathering her tablet. "I will let the front desk know to permanently block all calls from anyone matching their description. Have a great morning, Jada." She turned and walked out of the office, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind her. I turned my chair to face the massive windows looking out over the city. The sky was a brilliant, unclouded blue. For the first time in my 35 years, the heavy, toxic shadow of my family was completely gone. I had won. I had protected my son. I had defended my empire. I reached for my coffee, ready to dive into the quarterly projections, when a sharp, piercing chime echoed from my computer. It was not the standard gentle ping of a calendar reminder or a routine interoffice memo. It was the harsh, blaring alert of a priority red email. In my company, a priority red notification bypassed all filters. It meant a catastrophic supply chain failure, a massive legal threat, or a critical financial breach. I spun my chair around and grabbed my mouse, my heart rate instantly accelerating. I opened my inbox. The email was from David, my lead financial analyst, and the man who managed the back-end algorithms for Apex Holdings. The subject line was written in all capital letters. Urgent review required, Jamal Davis Hedge Fund. I clicked open the secure document. David did not waste time with pleasantries. He had attached a heavily encrypted dossier containing hundreds of pages of financial logs, wire transfers, and offshore account routing numbers. Jada, the brief message read. While processing the eviction and running the standard background checks on Jamal Davis, frozen assets, my team flagged a massive series of irregularities. His credit cards did not just bounce due to overextension. His entire fund is a ghost ship. We cross-referenced his corporate tax ID with the SEC database. He is not just broke Jada, he has been running a massive unverified Ponzi scheme. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the highlighted sections of the report. The numbers were staggering. He has been funneling investor capital into offshore shell companies, David report continued. The reason his accounts locked this weekend was not a bank error. The federal authorities froze his assets. The Securities and Exchange Commission is preparing to unseal an indictment. But that is not the worst part. Please review page 4 immediately. My fingers flew across the keyboard, scrolling down to the 4th page of the attached dossier. The screen populated with a scanned image of a corporate loan guarantee. It was dated exactly 3 years ago, right around the time Jamal had launched his supposedly elite hedge fund. I stared at the signatures on the bottom of the document, the blood freezing solid in my veins. Jamal had secured his initial seed capital by using massive collateral, but he had not used his own assets. He had leveraged the one tangible asset my parents actually owned free and clear. Vivian and Winston had willingly signed away the deed to their modest suburban home to guarantee Jamal fraudulent hedge fund, and Jamal had defaulted on the loan. The federal government was not just coming for Jamal, they were coming for my parents. The eviction at the lake house was just a preview. By the end of the week, Vivian and Winston were going to lose the roof over their heads. Jamal had not just ruined his own life, he had completely destroyed theirs. I hit the intercom button on my desk without taking my eyes off the glowing red text on my monitor. Chloe, cancel my 10 o'clock briefing. Tell David to get in here right now and tell him to bring the hard copies of the Atlas Freight acquisition file. Less than a minute later, my office door opened and David stepped inside. He was a brilliant, meticulous analyst who rarely showed emotion, but right now his expression was deadly serious. He closed the heavy oak door behind him, walked over to the interactive smartboard on my wall, and synced his tablet. The digital display flickered to life, projecting a massive web of financial spreadsheets routing numbers and offshore corporate structures. Talk to me, David, I said, leaning forward, resting my arms on the polished walnut desk. Explain how a distressed logistics shell company we are about to acquire is somehow tied to my brother collapsing hedge fund. David adjusted his glasses and pulled up the first slide. As you know, Jada, we initiated the buyout of Atlas Freight Solutions strictly for their regional trucking routes and their warehouse footprint in the Midwest. They have been hemorrhaging money for 3 years, and their core logistics business is effectively dead. But during our final phase of due diligence, my team dug into their secondary revenue streams to assess their liabilities. He highlighted a column of numbers in the red. Atlas Freight was not just moving cargo, David explained. The previous owners were running a shadow lending operation. They were extending high-interest, unverified credit to high-risk ventures that traditional banks refused to touch. It was a desperate attempt to keep their own company afloat. And their biggest client, their absolute most toxic liability, is a hedge fund called Sentinel Capital. Jamal Firm. I stated the reality of the situation settling over me like a heavy iron blanket. Exactly. David nodded, switching to a new slide that displayed Jamal corporate logo, alongside a horrifying descent of red financial markers. Jamal has been projecting an image of massive wealth, but the back-end reality is a total bloodbath. He made catastrophic leveraged bets in the tech sector 2 years ago and lost everything. Instead of admitting the loss to his investors, he started borrowing from shadow lenders like Atlas to cover his margin calls and pay fake dividends. He is running a textbook Ponzi scheme, and he is completely underwater. How deep, I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. $15 million, David said quietly. He is $15 million in the red to Atlas Freight alone. That does not even account for the other creditors who are currently freezing his accounts. I stood up and walked over to the smartboard, staring at the raw, undeniable math of my brother, profound failure. For my entire life, Vivian and Winston had paraded Jamal around as a financial prodigy. They had compared my steady, methodical climb in the logistics industry to his flashy overnight success. They had demanded I bow down to his superior intellect, and all along he was nothing more than a degenerate gambler playing with fake chips. And the collateral, I asked, tracing the line from Sentinel Capital to the attached asset folder. He did not secure a $15 million loan with just a smile and a custom-tailored suit. No, he did not. David agreed, bringing up the final document. He needed a tangible hard asset to guarantee the initial line of credit. Since he leases his cars and rents his luxury condo, he had nothing of value, so he used your parents' estate. The scanned image of the deed appeared on the screen. The signatures of Vivian and Winston Davis were clearly visible at the bottom of the guarantor agreement. They had literally bet their entire retirement, their home and their future on their golden child. And he had lost it all. He defaulted on the loan 3 months ago. David continued. The grace period expired yesterday. The federal authorities are already circling his offshore accounts, and the SEC is preparing an indictment for the fraud. But the hard debt, the $15 million, and the deed to your parents' home currently belongs to Atlas Freight Solutions. I turned slowly to face David, the pieces of the puzzle locking together with a satisfying mechanical precision. And we are acquiring Atlas Freight today, I said. David nodded, pulling a thick manila folder from his leather briefcase and placing it directly in the center of my desk. The final acquisition papers are fully drafted and vetted by our legal team, David said. The moment you sign these documents, Jada Logistics completely absorbs Atlas Freight. We take their trucks, we take their warehouses, and we take all of their outstanding receivables. If you sign this, you become the primary creditor holding Jamal debt. You will own the $15 million note, and you will hold the deed to Vivian and Winston House. I looked down at the manila folder. It was not just a stack of corporate paperwork. It was an executioner axe. For a decade, I had endured their insults, their dismissals, and their demands that I remember my place. They had treated me like dirt while living off the fraudulent spoils of a criminal. They had threatened to ruin my career just this morning, all to protect a man who had secretly gambled away their entire existence. Do we need to alter the acquisition strategy? David asked, watching me carefully. If you prefer, we can carve out the toxic debt and leave it with the Atlas Shell Company to avoid the familial complication. I reached into the breast pocket of my blazer and pulled out my titanium fountain pen. There is no complication, David, I said, unscrewing the cap. I am a businesswoman. We are acquiring the entirety of their assets. I flipped open the folder and signed my name on the dotted line with smooth, confident strokes. The ink bled into the paper binding the contract. I initialed the secondary pages, signed the transfer of liability agreements, and closed the folder with a sharp, definitive slap. File it immediately, I instructed, handing the folder back to David. Initiate the asset transfer and instruct the legal department to begin the collection process on the Sentinel Capital debt. I want a formal demand letter drafted and ready to serve by tomorrow morning. Understood. David said, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. It is officially your debt, Jada. You hold all the cards. David left the office, and I stood alone in the quiet space, letting the magnitude of the moment wash over me. I own Jamal. I owned my parents' estate. They were completely and utterly at my absolute mercy. The power was intoxicating, but I did not let it cloud my focus. I had an empire to run, and more importantly, I had a son to pick up from school. I checked my watch. It was exactly 2:45 in the afternoon. I packed my laptop into my tote bag, grabbed my keys, and headed out. Chloe waved as I passed her desk, and the warehouse floor managers nodded respectfully as I walked through the main lobby. I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air and climbed into my armored SUV. The drive to Trey Private Academy was serene. I listened to a classical piano concerto, letting the music wash away the corporate tension of the day. The academy was located in a highly exclusive wooded neighborhood on the edge of the city. It was a beautiful campus with old stone buildings and sprawling green lawns designed to provide a calm, nurturing environment for brilliant neurodivergent minds. I pulled into the pristine circular driveway, parking in the designated parent pickup lane. I turned off the engine and grabbed my purse, feeling lighter than I had in years. I was looking forward to seeing Trey, to hearing about his art projects, and taking him out for ice cream to celebrate a highly successful Monday. I stepped out of the vehicle and began walking toward the ornate wrought iron gates of the academy courtyard. The afternoon sun filtered through the massive oak trees, casting long shadows across the cobblestone walkway. Then I heard the sharp, frantic click of designer heels striking the pavement. I stopped walking. Parked haphazardly across two handicap spaces, half on the grass and half on the curb, was a silver luxury SUV. It was dusty and covered in dried mud from the lake house eviction. The engine was still running. A figure stepped out from behind the vehicle, blocking my path to the school gates. It was Vivian. But this was not the immaculate, untouchable matriarch who usually held court at charity galas. Her pristine white country club outfit was permanently stained with thick brown mud. Her hair, which was usually styled into a flawless bob, was tangled and windblown. Her expensive makeup was smeared under her eyes, and she was clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver. She looked absolutely unhinged. Her chest was heaving, and her eyes were wild, shifting frantically from my face to the private school gates and back again. She had tracked me down. She had somehow found the one place I kept completely insulated from the toxic radiation of my family. Jada. Vivian hissed, her voice raw and desperate, echoing loudly in the quiet school zone. "You are going to fix this. You are going to fix this right now." I stopped dead in my tracks on the cobblestone walkway. Vivian was panting slightly, her breath visible in the crisp afternoon air, standing between me and the heavy wrought iron gates of Trey Academy. The absolute sheer audacity of this woman was staggering. Just hours ago, on a recorded corporate phone line, she had tried to orchestrate my termination and destroy my livelihood. Now she was standing in front of my son's school, demanding I fix the catastrophic mess she and her golden child had created. "Fix what exactly, Mother?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "The fact that your son is a fraud, or the fact that you are currently trespassing in a school zone?" "Do not take that tone with me." Vivian snapped, her hands shaking as she clutched her ruined designer bag. "I am your mother. You owe me respect." Jamal's reputation took a massive hit this weekend because of that ridiculous misunderstanding at the lake house. The rumor mill is already spinning. His investors are getting jittery and asking questions about his liquidity. We need to project absolute family unity right now to kill the gossip. A misunderstanding. She was classifying a police eviction and a frozen bank account as a misunderstanding. The delusion was so deeply embedded in her psyche that it had entirely overwritten her reality. She was standing in muddy shoes, completely bankrupt, and she still thought she held the high ground. I crossed my arms over my tailored blazer. And what exactly does Jamal liquidity have to do with me? I do not run his fake hedge fund. Vivian practically stomped her foot on the pavement. Jamal Firm is hosting its 10-year anniversary gala this Saturday night at the Plaza Hotel. It has been planned for months. All of his primary tier investors will be there. The local business press will be there. We need to show them that the Davis family is a united, impenetrable front. I need you to attend the gala, Jada. I need you to stand there, smile, and play the supportive, quiet sister. It will prove to everyone that the rumors of familial infighting and financial distress are just petty jealousy. I stared at her, letting the absolute absurdity of her demand wash over me. She wanted me to be a prop. After a lifetime of hiding me in the background, of treating me like an embarrassing stain on their pristine country club image, they suddenly needed me to play a role. They needed me to stand in the corner in a cheap dress and nod silently while Jamal lied to his investors' faces. They did not know that the SEC was already drafting his federal indictment. They did not know that the offshore shell games had been flagged. And most importantly, Vivian had absolutely no idea that less than an hour ago, I had signed a corporate acquisition that made me the sole owner of the $15 million debt Jamal had secured using her house as collateral. I held the deed to her future in my leather tote bag, and she was ordering me to smile for the cameras. "I am not going to any gala," I said, my voice dropping to a glacial chill. "I am not playing a supportive prop for a man whose entire existence is a fabricated lie. Jamal entitlement created this disaster. He has been handed every single advantage on a silver platter his entire life, and he still managed to drive your family straight into a brick wall. I will not help him save face." Vivian's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The remaining shreds of her maternal performance completely evaporated. She took a step closer to me, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. "Handed everything on a silver platter." She hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. "You think Jamal was handed everything. You think his success was just given to him. We sacrificed our blood and sweat to build him up. We gave him the foundation he needed to become a titan. You have absolutely no idea what we had to do to ensure he had the right start in life." "You gave him my peace of mind," I countered, my voice rising just enough to match her intensity. "You sacrificed my mental health to stroke his ego. You funded his ridiculous lifestyle while telling me I was a burden. You never gave me a single dime of support. I built my life from nothing while you threw thousands of dollars at his customized luxury cars. Because you did not deserve it." Vivian shrieked, all sense of propriety vanishing into the cold air. "You think we were just going to waste good capital on a girl with no ambition? You think that money was yours to begin with? That $80,000 from your grandfather was completely wasted on you?" The world around me seemed to instantly stop spinning. The ambient noise of the city traffic, the wind rustling through the oak trees, the distant chatter of students leaving the academy, everything muted into absolute silence. I stared at the woman standing in front of me. "What did you just say?" I asked, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper. Vivian's chest was heaving, but she did not back down. The secret she had kept buried for over a decade had finally boiled over in a fit of uncontrollable rage. "You heard me," she spat, her eyes flashing with cruel defiance. "Your grandfather left that $80,000 trust fund specifically for your college tuition. He thought you were going to be some brilliant scholar. He thought you had potential. But Winston and I knew better. We knew you were just going to throw your life away on foolish pursuits. So we made an executive decision. We took it." I felt a cold, heavy stone drop directly into the pit of my stomach. When my grandfather died shortly before I graduated high school, I was told his estate had been tied up in medical debts. I was told there was nothing left. I had worked 3 grueling shifts at a local diner just to pay for my community college textbooks. I had skipped meals. I had walked miles in the rain because I could not afford a bus pass. "You stole my trust fund." I stated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. "We reallocated it," Vivian corrected fiercely, completely devoid of a single ounce of maternal instinct. Jamal needed a spectacular wedding to impress Lauren family. He needed to show those elite investors that he belonged in their circle. "We used your grandfather money to pay for the country club reception and the down payment on Jamal luxury condo. It was a strategic family investment. You forged my signature on a legal trust document and drained $80,000 to pay for a wedding cake and a condo down payment." I clarified, my mind rapidly processing the sheer magnitude of the financial and emotional betrayal. "It was an investment in the child who actually had a future," Vivian barked, leaning forward aggressively. "And look at where it got us. Jamal became a major player. And you are exactly where we knew you would end up. A single mother working some pathetic warehouse job, dragging down the family name. So yes, Jada, we took the money, and I would do it again in a heartbeat. Now you are going to show up to that gala on Saturday, and you are going to do your duty to this family. You owe us that much. I stood perfectly still, letting the cold, harsh reality of her justification wash over me. She felt absolutely no remorse. She viewed stealing my future as a smart business tactic. She had looked at her teenage daughter and decided I was nothing more than a financial donor for her golden son. I slowly turned my head. Standing just 3 feet away, holding his superhero drawing against his chest, was Trey. The heavy oak doors of the academy had opened while Vivian was screaming. He had walked out just in time to hear his grandmother proudly admit to stealing my college fund and calling me a pathetic warehouse worker. Trey's eyes were wide, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his drawing. He looked from Vivian to me, his brilliant mind processing the hostility, the betrayal, and the raw cruelty radiating from the woman who was supposed to be his grandmother. I looked back at Vivian. She had not even noticed Trey. She was entirely consumed by her own narcissistic rage, completely blind to the collateral damage she was causing. A profound icy calm settled over my entire body. The anger I had felt just moments ago completely evaporated, replaced by a chilling, lethal clarity. David had told me I held all the cards. He was wrong. I did not just hold the cards, I owned the entire casino. I slowly reached into my bag and pulled out my sunglasses, sliding them onto my face to mask the cold, predatory calculation in my eyes. I looked at the woman who had stolen my future to fund a Ponzi scheme. I looked at the woman who had just signed her own total absolute destruction. My lips curved into a slow, icy smile. "You are right, Mom," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly composed. "You made an investment, and you are absolutely correct about family duty." Vivian blinked, clearly thrown by my sudden shift in demeanor. She straightened her stained jacket, attempting to regain her haughty posture. "Good. I am glad you are finally seeing reason. Wear something appropriate. Black preferably. Try to blend in." I reached out and took Trey's hand, my grip warm and reassuring. He looked up at me, and I gave him a small, subtle wink. "Oh, I will not be blending in." "Mother," I promised softly, the threat completely flying over her head. "I will be at the Plaza Hotel on Saturday night. I would not miss Jamal's big 10-year anniversary gala for the world." I turned and walked past her, guiding Trey toward our waiting armored SUV. I did not look back as she marched triumphantly toward her muddy car, believing she had won the argument. She had absolutely no idea that on Saturday night she was not getting a supportive daughter. She was getting an executioner. The heavy armored SUV purred as we pulled away from the academy gate. I watched Vivian in the rearview mirror until she was nothing more than a muddy speck on the horizon. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel, my heart rhythm steady and cold. I did not drop Trey off at home. I pulled into the private driveway of a secondary nanny. I employed a woman of absolute discretion who Trey adored. Within 10 minutes, he was settled with his sketchbooks and a healthy snack entirely insulated from the venom his grandmother had just spewed. I returned to the driver's seat, pulled out my phone, and dialed David. My voice was calm, devoid of the shaking rage that had consumed me moments ago. "David, I am en route to the office. We are accelerating the acquisition of Atlas Freight. I want the final signatures ready the moment I walk through those doors. Do not worry about the premium for the expedited filing. Wire whatever they ask for. Just ensure the deal closes within 48 hours. David sounded surprised, but he did not hesitate. "Understood, Jada. We are already prepared for the final vetting. I will be ready." The drive to the Jada Logistics headquarters felt like an ascent into a command center. I parked in my executive slot and marched through the lobby, my heels clicking like gunfire on the polished marble. My employees knew better than to ask questions when my expression was this guarded. They stepped aside, heads bowed, as I strode toward the elevator. When the doors to my office suite slid open, David was already waiting, the manila folder held out like an offering. He led me straight into the private conference room, the one equipped with a secure server linked to our offshore legal team. "Sit," I ordered. "Walk me through the final audit. I do not want the highlights. I want the autopsy." David sat opening the laptop and projecting the data onto the wall. "This is where it gets worse, Jada." We started digging into Atlas Freight's ledger to ensure we weren't just buying debt. We found the debt, but we also found the source of their primary liquidity. It is essentially a Ponzi scheme, but a sloppy one. Jamal was taking money from newer investors to pay off the interest on loans to older investors, all while inflating the value of his own firm's holdings. He has been bleeding the company dry for years. He pointed to a series of wire transfers. Lauren was not just living off her husband's salary. She had been treating the corporate accounts like her personal slush fund. "Look at these entries. $3,000 for a single weekend at a spa in Scottsdale, $12,000 for a custom handbag shipment from Milan. All of it routed through Atlas Freight's accounts under the guise of consulting fees. They weren't just incompetent, they were embezzling." I watched the red lines dance across the screen, a digital representation of my family's moral and financial decay. They had judged me for my modest warehouse business, yet they had been building a palace out of stolen sand and criminal fraud. The deeper we dug, the more repulsive the picture became. Jamal had lived his entire adult life as a performance. Every suit, every watch, every networking event was paid for by leveraging money that didn't exist. He had convinced my parents he was a genius, the one who had finally broken into the elite tier of hedge fund managers, all while he was meticulously crafting a financial guillotine for himself. And the parents, I asked, leaning into the light of the projector, "Where exactly do Vivian and Winston stand in this house of cards?" David hesitated, his cursor hovering over a file labeled Asset Collateralization. "This is the part that will be difficult to digest." When Jamal's primary credit line with the shadow lenders began to dry up 2 years ago, he needed a way to secure a fresh $15 million infusion. His own assets were worthless. The firm was already reporting losses. So he went to your parents. He pulled up a digital scan of a legal document. It was a primary mortgage guarantee. Your parents leveraged their home, their primary residence, to act as the sole guarantor for his loan. They didn't just give him money. They bet the roof over their heads on his success. And because the loan was tied to Atlas Freight's shadow operations, there was no protection. If the debt is called in, the house goes. Immediately. I felt a strange chilling sensation run down my spine. Vivian had stood at the school gate and screamed at me about strategic investments. She had berated me for my lack of ambition. All the while, she had been gambling away her own future, blinded by her obsession with Jamal's status. She had sacrificed her financial stability, her home, and her dignity to prop up a lie, all because she couldn't bear the thought of her daughter, me, being the one who actually succeeded. David looked at me, his eyes filled with professional concern. "The acquisition of Atlas Freight officially transfers all these debts, receivables, and collateral agreements to us. Once you sign the final papers, Jada, you become the primary creditor. You hold the note on Jamal's fraud, and you hold the deed to your parents' house. You can force the foreclosure the moment the ink is dry." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. The sunset was painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and gold. I thought of the $80,000. That money had been my grandfather's gift, intended to set me on a path to independence. Vivian and Winston had stolen it to buy a wedding cake and a condo down payment. They had treated my future as disposable. Now their entire existence was sitting in a manila folder on my desk. It was no longer about the money. It was about the utter bankruptcy of their character. They had raised a criminal and destroyed their daughter to maintain the appearance of perfection. Now they were about to lose everything. "Do it," I said, my voice cold and firm. "Do not carve out the debt. Do not separate the liabilities. Acquire everything, all of it." David began typing, his fingers flying across the keys. By the time I walked out of that conference room, the wheels of corporate machinery were in motion. The legal team had already drafted the demand notices. The accountants were finalizing the asset transfers. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of meetings, signatures, and strategic maneuvering. I was no longer the daughter they ignored. I was the corporate entity that now dictated their reality. On Friday afternoon at exactly 3:30, I sat in my office. My desk was clear save for a single black pen and the final closing documents for the Atlas Freight acquisition. My phone sat in front of me silent. I knew they were panicking. I knew Jamal was running out of time, his accounts being drained by the SEC, his creditors finally waking up to the fraud. At exactly 4 o'clock, I signed the final page of the acquisition agreement. I was now the primary creditor. I was now the holder of the note. I was the silent partner who had just become their worst nightmare. I leaned back in my chair, the silence of the office wrapping around me like a shroud. I thought about the gala tomorrow night. Jamal would be there, expecting to play the role of the successful hedge fund manager in front of his investors. He would be expecting me to show up as the quiet, supportive sister. He had no idea that I was coming to collect. The door to my office opened and David entered holding a tablet. "Everything is processed, Jada. The Atlas Freight debt is transferred. You are the sole lien holder on the Davis estate. The demand letters for the total $15 million debt are drafted. I have the courier service on standby to serve Jamal personally at the gala tomorrow night." I took the tablet, scrolling through the legal confirmation. It was all there. Every line of credit, every defaulted payment, every dollar of the fraud that had brought my brother to the precipice. And the house deed sitting there like a final period at the end of a long, dark sentence. "Perfect," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "Deliver the demand letter to Jamal at the gala. Do not do it privately. Do it in front of his investors. Let them know exactly who they have been funding. And notify our legal team to begin the foreclosure proceedings on my parents' home on Monday morning. I want them to have the weekend to realize what is coming." David nodded, his face unreadable. "It will be done." He left the office, leaving me in the gathering dusk. I turned my chair to face the window again, watching the lights of the city flicker to life one by one. I had spent years being defined by their limitations, their neglect, and their petty cruelty. I had spent years struggling in the shadow of their golden child. But as the clock ticked past 4, I realized that the struggle had only sharpened my edge. They had taught me that success was a zero-sum game. They had taught me that survival was the only metric that mattered. And now they were going to learn that I had been the one paying attention all along. Tomorrow night at the gala, the world would learn the truth about Jamal Davis. And by Monday morning, Vivian and Winston would finally understand the cost of their investments. I picked up my phone and opened the invitation for tomorrow's gala. I hit accept on the digital RSVP, a small clinical movement that signaled the end of their era. I stood up, walked to the closet, and pulled out the dress I had already selected. It was black, form-fitting, elegant, and sharp enough to draw blood. I was going to Jamal's anniversary party. I was going to stand in front of his elite investors and show them exactly what a failure looked like. And then I was going to take everything else. The penthouse was perfectly still as the sun dipped below the city skyline on Saturday evening. For 35 years, getting ready for a family event meant carefully selecting an outfit that would not attract Vivian's sharp critiques or Jamal's condescending smirks. It meant shrinking myself, muting my colors, and practicing a quiet, apologetic demeanor to make them feel larger and more important. That era was officially dead. I walked into my expansive walk-in closet and bypassed the understated business suits and modest cocktail dresses I usually wore to corporate functions. Tonight was not about blending in or making anyone comfortable. Tonight required battle armor. I pulled a heavy garment bag from the back of the cedar wardrobe and unzipped it. The gown inside was a custom haute couture masterpiece I had commissioned in Paris after Jada Logistics cleared its first $100 million in valuation. I had never worn it. At the time, it felt too bold, too unapologetic for the woman I used to be. But the woman I was tonight, the sole owner of my brother's toxic debt and the legal master of my parents' future, was finally ready for it. The dress was a breathtaking column of midnight black silk velvet. It featured a plunging architectural neckline, sharp structured shoulders, and a sweeping train that commanded physical space. It did not ask for permission to exist in a room. It demanded absolute attention. As I slipped it on, the heavy fabric molded perfectly to my frame, making me feel invincible. I sat at my vanity and applied a bold matte red lipstick, pulling my thick natural hair back into a sleek structural updo that highlighted the sharp angles of my cheekbones. I fastened a pair of flawless 2-carat diamond stud earrings to my lobe stones, bought with my own money earned through my own brilliance. I looked in the mirror and did not see the pathetic, struggling warehouse worker my mother had sneered at outside the academy gates. I saw a self-made, powerful African-American woman who had built a national empire entirely in the shadows. I looked absolutely lethal. A soft knock at my bedroom door broke the silence. Mrs. Higgins, the elite private nanny I retained for late-night corporate emergencies, stood in the hallway. She was a warm, no-nonsense British expatriate with a background in childhood development and absolute discretion. "Trey is just finishing his dinner in the kitchen," Mrs. Higgins said, offering a warm smile. "We have a full evening of building advanced architectural Lego sets planned, followed by a documentary on the solar system. He will be perfectly entertained." "Thank you, Mrs. Higgins." I walked down the hallway, the silk train of my gown gliding silently across the hardwood floor. Trey was sitting at the marble kitchen island, happily munching on a grilled chicken sandwich. He looked up, his eyes widening with childhood wonder as he took in my appearance. "You look like a movie star, Mom." He beamed, a smudge of ketchup on his chin. "Are you going to a party?" I reached out and gently wiped the ketchup away with a napkin. "I am going to a very important business meeting, baby. You listen to Mrs. Higgins and have fun tonight. I will be home before you wake up tomorrow." I kissed the top of his head, breathing in the scent of his shampoo. My primary objective was to ensure Trey remained completely insulated from the impending blast radius. He did not need to witness the destruction of his uncle or the absolute humiliation of his grandmother. He was safe, secure, and entirely shielded from the toxic fallout of the Davis family. I took the private elevator down to the subterranean parking garage of my building. My standard armored SUV had been replaced for the evening by a sleek, midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom. The chauffeur, a towering man in a crisp, tailored suit, opened the rear door for me with a respectful nod. Waiting beside the vehicle were two men who looked like they had just stepped out of a tactical military briefing. I had contracted a high-end private security firm earlier that morning. They wore immaculate dark suits with discreet earpieces, but their sheer physical size and hyper-alert demeanors broadcasted a clear message of untouchable authority. They were not there just for physical protection. They were a highly visible psychological tactic. Jamal thrived on intimidation and perceived dominance. I was bringing a physical manifestation of power that his fake wealth could never buy. "We are ready when you are, Miss Davis," the lead security officer said, taking the passenger seat while his partner followed closely behind us in a secondary black SUV. "Take us to the Ritz-Carlton," I instructed the driver. The ride through the glittering downtown streets was smooth and silent. I watched the city lights reflect off the tinted windows, my mind perfectly clear. There was no anxiety, no lingering guilt about destroying my blood relatives. They had stolen the $80,000 trust fund my grandfather left to secure my future, using it to buy a wedding cake and a condo down payment for a fraudster. They had mocked my child. They had actively tried to destroy my logistics company on a recorded line. Tonight was simply the delivery of the invoice they had been racking up for decades. The Rolls-Royce glided to a halt in front of the grand illuminated entrance of the Ritz-Carlton. The valet rushed forward to open my door, pausing slightly as my massive security detail stepped out first, securing the perimeter with professional efficiency. I stepped onto the pavement, the cool evening air washing over me. Photographers and minor local press were clustered near the red carpet entrance, snapping pictures of the city's financial elite as they entered Sentinel Capital's 10th anniversary gala. I did not pause for the cameras, nor did I hide from them. I walked straight up the marble steps, flanked by my imposing security detail. The attendees milling around the opulent lobby parted like the Red Sea, their eyes drawn to the commanding presence of the woman in the midnight black silk gown and her tactical escorts. Whispers rippled through the crowd as people tried to place my face, entirely unaware that the sister Jamal constantly downplayed was walking among them with the power to liquidate the entire event. I bypassed the coat check and the bustling cocktail reception, moving with deliberate predatory grace toward the main event space. The grand corridors of the Ritz-Carlton were lined with gilded mirrors and opulent floral arrangements, a desperate, expensive facade masking the $15 million of toxic debt currently sitting in a manila folder in my office. I stopped just outside the massive closed double doors of the primary ballroom. The heavy mahogany panels were trimmed in gold leaf, securely shutting the elite guests inside for the keynote presentation. Through the thick wood, the muffled sounds of polite applause faded into a hushed, expectant silence. Then the booming, amplified voice of my brother echoed through the sound system. 10 years! Jamal projected, his tone dripping with the manufactured, pompous arrogance of a man who actually believed his own lies. 10 years of unparalleled growth. But what truly sets Sentinel Capital apart is not just the profit margins. It is the foundation. It is the unwavering commitment to family values and the absolute dedication to building a legacy that will outlast us all. The sheer unadulterated hypocrisy of his words practically vibrated through the floorboards. He was standing on a stage lecturing wealthy investors about family values, while the deed to his parents' home sat in my corporate vault because he had secretly gambled it away. He was preaching about building a legacy, completely ignorant of the fact that his legacy was currently being unsealed by federal prosecutors. I stood outside the grand gilded doors, the heavy silk velvet of my gown pooling around my feet. I looked at the lead security officer standing to my right. His eyes were locked on the entrance, waiting for my command. I took a single, slow, deep breath, letting the final trace of the old Jada exit my lungs forever. I gave the security officer a sharp, definitive nod. He stepped forward, placed his hands on the brass handles, and pushed the heavy doors wide open. The heavy mahogany doors swung open with a resounding thud that momentarily disrupted the low hum of classical music and clinking crystal. I stepped across the threshold into the Ritz-Carlton ballroom. It was a sea of the city financial elite. Tuxedos and diamonds glittered under the massive crystal chandeliers. Waiters in pristine white coats circulated with silver trays of champagne. At the far end of the room, on a raised, brightly lit stage, Jamal stood at a podium. He was mid-sentence, projecting the image of a brilliant financial titan to a room full of people he was actively defrauding. My two security operatives remained flanking the entrance, standing like stone gargoyles. Their sheer size and tactical demeanor instantly drew confused, nervous glances from the catering staff and the guests nearest the doors. I did not stop to explain their presence. I moved forward, the heavy black silk velvet of my gown sweeping across the intricately patterned carpet with lethal grace. I had not made it 20 feet into the room before my parents intercepted me. They materialized from the crowd like heat-seeking missiles, their faces flushed with a mixture of absolute panic and furious indignation. They moved with a desperate, frantic energy, terrified that my mere presence would shatter the illusion of their perfect family. Vivian reached out, her fingers digging painfully into my upper arm. She yanked me toward the dimly lit periphery of the ballroom, dragging me behind a towering floral arrangement of white hydrangeas and orchids. Winston flanked my other side, stepping close to physically block me from the view of the main floor. He was acting as his wife, silent enforcer, treating me like a threat that needed to be neutralized. "What are you doing here?" Vivian hissed, her voice a frantic, venomous whisper that she struggled to keep quiet. "I told you to blend in. I told you to be quiet. You march in here looking like you are trying to upstage your brother at his own anniversary event. You are drawing attention to yourself. You need to get to the back." Winston added, his jaw tight as he scanned the room over my shoulder to see who had noticed my entrance. "We have a table reserved for you near the kitchen doors in the overflow section. Go sit down, keep your mouth shut, and do not speak to any of the investors." Jamal is trying to close a critical funding round tonight to expand his portfolio. We cannot have you out here embarrassing the family and reminding everyone about your warehouse job. I looked down at my mother hand still clutching my arm like a vice. For 35 years, that grip had commanded me. It had steered me into corners, forced me into shadows, and demanded my silence so Jamal could shine. Today, her grip felt remarkably weak. They were standing in front of me entirely bankrupt, clinging to the illusion of status while I held the very deed to their home in my corporate vault. Before I could formulate a response, Lauren appeared. She slithered out from the crowd, a flute of champagne balanced in her hand, wearing a sequined gold gown that screamed of desperation and stolen funds. The overwhelming scent of her expensive floral perfume hit me a second before she spoke. Her eyes raked up and down my custom Parisian couture, her upper lip curling into a sneer of pure, unfiltered disdain. "Well, look who decided to play dress-up." Lauren mocked, her voice intentionally loud enough to turn the heads of a nearby group of tech executives. "Did you max out your credit cards to rent that Jada? Or did you find a cheap knockoff online? You cannot just slap on a fancy dress and pretend you belong in this tax bracket. These people manage real wealth. They can smell a fake a mile away. You are going to humiliate Jamal looking like a desperate social climber trying to rub elbows with the elite." I stared at Lauren, maintaining a mask of absolute calm. She was wearing jewelry paid for by embezzled corporate funds, drinking champagne funded by a collapsing Ponzi scheme, and lecturing me about pretending to belong to a tax bracket I had surpassed a decade ago. The absolute irony was so potent I could practically taste it. She was standing on the deck of a sinking ship, demanding that I admire her view. I did not waste a single breath defending my wardrobe. I did not justify my presence. I did not engage in the petty squabbling they desperately wanted. I simply looked at Vivian and calmly, deliberately brushed her hand off my arm. The movement was so smooth and absolute that she stumbled back a half step in sheer shock. She opened her mouth to reprimand me, but I had already turned away. On the main stage, Jamal tapped the microphone. The high-pitched feedback silenced the remaining chatter in the ballroom. The string quartet stopped playing. Hundreds of faces turned toward the podium, waiting for the golden child to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jamal boomed, his voice echoing off the gilded ceiling, "Sentinel Capital is more than just a fund. It is a family. And a family is built on the strength of its foundation. We are entering our next phase of monumental growth, and I could not have done it without the unwavering belief of the people who hold our debt and secure our future." Jamal raised his crystal glass high into the air, flashing his perfect fraudulent smile. He looked out over the crowd, playing the role of the humble visionary to absolute perfection. "I ask my primary investors, and specifically our senior creditors, to please stand," Jamal announced. "Let this room give you a round of applause for carrying Sentinel Capital into its next decade of prosperity. We honor the people who own a piece of this incredible journey." The ballroom remained seated for a split second as people prepared to clap for the unnamed financial backers. I did not hesitate. I stepped out from behind the floral arrangement, walking straight past my open-mouthed parents and my sneering sister-in-law. I marched directly down the center aisle of the ballroom, the crowd parting before me as the heavy silk of my gown whispered against the floor. I walked right up to the absolute front row, directly in Jamal's line of sight. And I stood. I stood at the absolute epicenter of the ballroom. The silence that descended over the hundreds of attendees was sudden and suffocating. Jamal was mid-smile, his crystal glass still raised in a triumphant toast to his saviors. When his eyes locked onto mine, the color drained from his face so rapidly he looked as though he might physically collapse. He blinked rapidly, clearly waiting for the actual creditors from the shadow lending firm to stand up behind me. When no one else moved, the horrifying reality of the moment began to suffocate him. The murmurs started almost instantly. Wealthy investors, tech founders, and local politicians exchanged confused, irritated glances. This was not part of the script. I was supposed to be the invisible, compliant sister tucked away in the back near the kitchen doors. Instead, I was commanding the front row in custom Parisian velvet, flanked by tactical security looking down at him with the cold authority of an executioner. Jamal tried desperately to recover. He lowered his glass and forced a hollow, echoing laugh into the microphone. He gripped the edges of the podium so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Well," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it back into its usual pompous cadence. "It seems my little sister got a bit confused by the prompt." "Jada, please have a seat. We are honoring our primary financial partners right now." He gestured toward the back of the room with a condescending wave of his hand, treating me like a lost child who had wandered onto a stage. "Let us give a hand to familial enthusiasm, ladies and gentlemen. She means well." I did not sit down. I did not break eye contact. I kept my gaze locked on his sweating face and gave a single deliberate nod toward the raised audiovisual booth at the back of the ballroom. 3 hours ago, I had handed the lead technician a crisp $5,000 cash tip and a silver encrypted flash drive. My instructions had been exceptionally clear. I did not need to shout or cause a scene. I had outsourced my destruction. The booming inspirational background music instantly cut out, leaving a ringing dead air in its wake. The massive high-definition projector screen behind Jamal went pitch black for a fraction of a second. Then it illuminated the entire room with the blinding white light of a scanned legal document. It was not a celebratory montage of Sentinel Capital achievements. It was the official police eviction notice from the lake house, complete with the county sheriff's seal and Jamal's signature. The text was blown up to 15 feet tall. The word "default" stamped across the top in bold ink was impossible to miss. A collective gasp rippled through the elite crowd. The polite clinking of crystal glasses ceased entirely. Men in bespoke tuxedos leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Jamal whipped around his jaw, dropping as he stared at his own humiliating reality broadcasted to his elite circle. "Turn that off!" Jamal shouted, slapping the side of the podium, his voice devoid of its previous slick charm. "Cut the feed right now. That is an administrative error." But the slides were on a timed, automated loop, completely out of his control. The screen shifted. A new document appeared. It was the heavily redacted yet undeniable ledger of his $15 million default. The catastrophic negative balances glowed brightly. Next came the corporate credit card statements, the very records David and I had audited just yesterday. Lauren's name was highlighted in stark, inescapable yellow. $3,000 for a single weekend at a luxury spa in Scottsdale. $12,000 for a custom handbag shipment from Milan, all routed through Sentinel Capital accounts, all flagged as fraudulent corporate embezzlement. I heard a sharp, strangled noise behind me. Lauren was staring at the screen, her mouth hanging open. Her champagne flute slipped from her manicured fingers, shattering against the marble floor in a spray of glass and expensive alcohol. Vivian had both hands clamped over her mouth, her face a mask of absolute paralyzing horror. The flawless illusion she had sacrificed my future to protect was disintegrating in real time, right in front of the very people she so desperately wanted to impress. Winston looked like he had been physically struck, frozen in place by the sheer magnitude of the public exposure. The investors in the room were no longer whispering. They were murmuring in furious, urgent tones. Cell phones were being pulled out of pockets. Lawyers and accountants were being texted frantically. The men and women who had trusted Jamal with their millions were realizing in real time that they had been funding a lavish criminal lifestyle. The brilliant hedge fund manager they thought they were celebrating was nothing more than a cheap con artist running a Ponzi scheme on their dime. A frantic event coordinator rushed down the side aisle holding a wireless microphone, her eyes darting around as she desperately tried to figure out who was supposed to be doing damage control. She was heading for the stage, intending to hand it to Jamal. I stepped effortlessly into her path. Without a single word, I reached out and took the microphone from her shaking hand. My security detail stepped up simultaneously, forming an impenetrable physical barrier between me and anyone who might think about intervening. I turned my back on the shattered remains of my parents and faced the stage. I switched the microphone on. The sharp click echoed through the massive speakers, cutting through the rising panic and angry muttering of the ballroom. I looked up at the man who had stolen my inheritance, who had bled his family dry, and who had spent his entire life treating me like dirt on his shoes. I held his gaze as he stared down at me. his chest heaving with panic, finally realizing that the quiet sister he had always underestimated was the architect of his demise. Jamal loves talking about kids with a future, I said, my voice ringing out through the ballroom, cold, level, and absolutely lethal. Let's talk about yours, brother. The microphone amplified my voice, sending it vibrating through the rib cages of every billionaire, socialite, and corporate lawyer in the room. Jamal stood frozen behind his podium, his perfectly tailored suit suddenly looking like a borrowed costume. He opened his mouth to speak, to spin another web of charming deceit, but no words came out. He was staring at the $15 million death warrant glowing on the projector screen behind him. I stepped off the front row boundary and moved toward the center aisle, commanding the room with the practiced ease of a woman who had built an empire from scrap metal and concrete. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The absolute terrifying truth did the heavy lifting for me. For the past 10 years, my brother has stood on stages exactly like this one, selling you a vision of unparalleled financial growth, I said, pacing slowly, my eyes panning across the sea of horrified investors. He promised you elite returns. He promised you a legacy. But Sentinel Capital is not a hedge fund. It is a wildly incompetent Ponzi scheme designed to fund his counterfeit existence. A low murmur of panic began to ripple through the crowd. Men in bespoke suits shifted uncomfortably, their hands instinctively dropping to their pockets to retrieve their phones. If you look at the screen, I continued, gesturing gracefully toward the massive projection, you will see exactly where your capital investments have gone. Jamal has not been securing secondary market assets. He has been taking your fresh capital to pay the interest on his shadow loans, effectively bleeding this company dry to keep the lights on. But more importantly, he has been treating your money as a personal slush fund. I turned my gaze directly to Lauren. She was still standing near the edge of the aisle, her face drained of color, her sequined gold gown suddenly looking cheap and gaudy under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. Your money did not go into high-yield offshore accounts, I announced, ensuring my voice reached every corner of the ballroom. It went to my sister-in-law. It paid for $12,000 custom handbag shipments from Milan. It covered $3,000 weekend spa retreats in Scottsdale. Your capital has been financing her weekly country club dues, her private Pilates instructors, and the lease on a luxury SUV she drives to charity luncheons. You are not investing in a financial prodigy. You are bankrolling a desperate social climber who uses corporate accounts to pretend she belongs in this tax bracket. Lauren let out a sharp, humiliated gasp. She shrank back as the wealthy elite around her physically stepped away, treating her like a walking contagion. The whispers erupted into audible, angry conversations. Investors were realizing they had been utterly played. "Shut her up!" Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. My mother shoved her way through the crowd, her face a mask of purple, unhinged rage. Winston was right behind her, his fists clenched, his chest heaving. They completely abandoned their carefully cultivated country club composure, terrified of the social execution happening in real time. "She is lying," Vivian screamed at the crowd, pointing a shaking manicured finger at me. "She is a jealous, pathetic liar. She is just a warehouse worker trying to ruin her brother because she has nothing of her own. Turn off that microphone. Security, remove her." My two private security operatives instantly stepped forward, forming a massive, impenetrable wall of muscle between my parents and me. Winston collided with one of my guards, bouncing off the man's solid frame like a paperweight. He stumbled back, humiliated and completely powerless. I did not flinch. I kept the microphone close to my mouth, turning my lethal focus entirely onto the two people who had created this monster. "And here we have the architects of the illusion," I stated, my voice dropping to a glacial chill that silenced my mother's shrieking. Winston and Vivian Davis, the parents who were so desperate to manufacture a golden child that they were willing to cannibalize their own daughter to do it. I took a step closer to the security line, looking down at the woman who had stood outside my son's school and mocked my existence just 24 hours ago. "My parents love to talk about strategic investments," I told the crowd. "Let me tell you about their best one. When I was 18, my grandfather left me an $80,000 trust fund intended for my college tuition. My parents forged my signature, drained the account, and stole my future. And what did they buy with that stolen money? They bought the country club wedding reception and the luxury condo down payment that allowed Jamal to trick his way into your social circles. They built this entire fraud on a foundation of theft. Vivian clutched her chest, her mouth opening and closing as the surrounding socialites stared at her in sheer, unadulterated disgust. She was a pariah. Her social standing was evaporating into ash. But that is not the best part. I continued, my tone hardening into absolute steel. When Jamal ran out of stolen trust funds and began defaulting on his shadow loans 2 years ago, he went back to the bank of Mom and Dad. I hope your elite friends in this room know the truth, Vivian. I hope they know that you and Winston put your primary mansion up as collateral for a bankrupt man. You gambled the roof over your heads to protect a lie. Winston staggered backward, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He reached out to grab a chair for support, his knees buckling under the weight of his total financial ruin being broadcasted to his peers. On stage, Jamal was hyperventilating. He gripped the microphone stand, his eyes wild and bloodshot. You cannot do this, Jada. You do not have the authority. The shadow lenders are going to give me an extension. I was negotiating a bridge loan. I smiled. It was a slow, predatory curving of my lips that made Jamal flinch. The shadow lenders got tired of your excuses, Jamal, I said, my voice echoing with finality. They packaged your toxic debt and they sold it, all $15 million of it. I reached into my designer clutch, pulled out the heavy notarized acquisition agreement and held it up for the entire ballroom to see. And I bought it. I announced, dropping the ultimate crushing blow. I am the new owner of Atlas Freight. I am your majority debt holder. I own the note on this firm and I hold the deed to our parents' house. I own your entire reality. And as your primary creditor, I am officially calling in the debt. You have 30 days to vacate the premises, liquidate your remaining assets, and hand over the keys. I lowered the microphone. The click of the power switch sounded like a gunshot. Absolute pandemonium erupted. The ballroom fractured into total uncontrollable chaos. Investors rushed for the exits, screaming into their cell phones, desperately dialing their legal teams to freeze their assets and pull their remaining funds. Men in tuxedos were shouting, overturning cocktail tables in their rush to get out of the blast radius. Lauren collapsed onto the floor. Her knees gave out, sending her crashing onto the polished marble. She broke down in loud, ugly, heaving sobs, her gold dress pooling around her like a discarded wrapper, her mascara running in dark streaks down her face. Jamal stood at the podium, completely paralyzed, watching his empire burn to the ground. At the back of the ballroom, the heavy oak doors swung open once more. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the grand corridor outside. Uniformed police officers and plainclothes detectives marched into the room, their badges gleaming under the chandeliers. My legal team had sent the embezzlement files to the authorities the moment I signed the acquisition paperwork. I handed the microphone back to the stunned event coordinator, turned my back on the wreckage of the Davis family, and walked out of the ballroom. Fast forward 3 weeks. The collapse of Jamal was not just a local news story, it was a spectacular, highly publicized financial execution. Federal agents had raided the Sentinel Capital offices before the ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton had even been cleared of its stunned guests. Jamal went from being the golden child of the city elite to a federal flight risk overnight. His assets, his offshore accounts, and his luxury sports cars were entirely frozen by the Securities and Exchange Commission. I watched his perp walk on the evening news from the comfort of my living room, sipping tea while he shielded his face from the flashing cameras. He looked small. Stripped of his embezzled wealth and his arrogant smirk, he was nothing but a terrified man facing 20 years in federal prison. Lauren predictably did not stand by her husband in his darkest hour. She was the ultimate opportunist, and a sinking ship held no value for her. The moment the handcuffs clicked around Jamal's wrists, she was on the phone with the most ruthless divorce attorney she could find on credit. She filed for divorce within 48 hours, citing irrecoverable emotional distress. In a desperate bid for survival, she tried to liquidate everything she could hide. She frantically attempted to sell her designer bags to online consignment shops and tried to wire funds from a hidden offshore account. She failed. The federal investigators had already flagged her as a co-conspirator in the embezzlement scheme. The woman who had mocked my wardrobe was now sleeping on her Pilates instructor couch. Her accounts frozen, her reputation reduced to a punchline in the local tabloids. But the most poetic destruction belonged to Winston and Vivian. I had given them 30 days to vacate their mansion. But the reality of their bankruptcy moved much faster than my deadline. Once the news of the Ponzi scheme broke, the bank swooped in to secure their collateral. The foreclosure was swift and brutally public. Massive moving trucks lined their manicured driveway in broad daylight, hauling away the antique mahogany furniture and the Persian rugs they had valued more than their own daughter. Their pristine social standing evaporated into thin air. At the country club, their memberships were revoked immediately. The very people who had drank their champagne and attended their lavish dinner parties now crossed the street to avoid them. They were absolute pariahs in their community. They had sacrificed my future to buy their way into the elite, and the elite had chewed them up and spit them out the second the checks bounced. I was reviewing the quarterly projections for Atlas Freight in my home office when the intercom on my desk buzzed. It was Marcus, the head of security for my private gated community. He sounded deeply uncomfortable. He informed me that a woman claiming to be my mother was at the main estate gate. She was weeping, causing a disturbance, and aggressively refusing to leave the premises. He asked if I wanted him to call the local police to have her removed for trespassing. I told Marcus to stand down. I would handle it myself. I walked down the long, winding driveway of my estate. The morning air was crisp, the towering oak trees casting long shadows across the pristine pavement. When I reached the imposing wrought iron security gates, I stopped. Vivian stood on the other side of the heavy metal bars. She looked like a ghost of the woman who had grabbed my arm in the ballroom just weeks prior. She had aged 10 years. Her roots were showing, her posture was slumped, and she was clutching a battered designer handbag to her chest like a shield. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, frantic with a wild desperation I had never seen in her before. "Jada!" She gasped, her hands gripping the cold iron bars as if she were trying to physically pull them apart. "Oh, thank God. Thank God you came down. You have to help us. Please, you have to tell security to open the gate." I stared at her, maintaining a comfortable, detached distance. I did not say a single word. I simply let her hear the silence, let her feel the impenetrable physical barrier between her reality and mine. "We have nowhere to go, Jada," she sobbed, tears spilling over her eyelashes and cutting tracks through her makeup. "The bank locked the doors yesterday. We are sleeping in a cheap motel by the highway. Winston Hart cannot take this stress. He is having chest pains. Our friends will not even answer our phone calls. Everyone abandoned us. You need to let us in," she begged, her voice pitching into a hysterical whine. "We are family. We share blood. You cannot just leave your own mother and father out on the street. We can stay in your guest house. We will not take up any space, just until we get back on our feet." I looked at her hands gripping the bars. I thought about those same hands signing away my college trust fund. I thought about those same hands clapping for Jamal as he spent my inheritance on a fraudulent empire. Blood did not stop you from stealing $80,000 from an 18-year-old girl. I said, my voice eerily calm and devoid of any sympathy. Blood did not stop you from forcing me to sleep in a freezing warehouse while you drank champagne on my stolen dime. You are not my family, Vivian. You are just a bad investment that finally went bankrupt. Vivian let out a strangled, desperate noise. She realized the tears were not working. The guilt was not working. I was entirely immune to the emotional manipulation that had controlled me for decades. Her eyes darted wildly around my property, peering through the iron gates, scanning the manicured lawns and the sprawling facade of my home in the distance. She was searching for a new angle, a new vulnerability to exploit. "Where is Trey?" she asked, her voice suddenly shifting from a frantic sob to a sickeningly sweet, urgent tone. She pressed her face closer to the bars, craning her neck to look past me toward the house. "I just want to see my grandson. Where is he? Bring him out here." I need to see my favorite brilliant grandson. The air between us dropped to freezing. Every muscle in my body locked into place as my expression turned to absolute stone. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the woman standing in front of me was breathtaking. For 10 years, Vivian had treated my son like an invisible burden. She had forgotten his birthdays. She had criticized his quiet nature. She had actively excluded him from family photos, pushing him out of the frame so Jamal and Lauren could take center stage. Now, standing on the precipice of homelessness, she suddenly remembered she was a grandmother. She was trying to use my child as a human shield against the consequences of her own horrific choices. "Do not ever say his name," I commanded. My voice was not a shout. It was a low, vibrating growl that carried the weight of a decade of suppressed maternal rage. Vivian flinched physically, recoiling from the iron bars. Her manicured hands slipped down the metal, her knuckles white and trembling. "But Jada," she whimpered, trying to force a pathetic maternal wobble into her tone. "I am his grandmother. I love him. He needs his family around him. We can start over. We can be a real family now." I stepped right up to the gate, separating myself from her by mere inches of wrought iron. I looked directly into her terrified, calculating eyes. "You made your choice at the barbecue, Vivian," I stated, enunciating every single syllable with lethal precision. "You looked me in the eye and told me that burgers were only for kids with a future. You looked at my brilliant, kind-hearted son and decided he was not worth a plate at your table because he did not fit your glossy, fraudulent country club aesthetic. You chose Jamal. You chose Lauren. You chose the illusion." Vivian opened her mouth, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her cheeks, but I did not give her a fraction of a second to speak. "Well, the illusion is dead," I continued, my voice colder than the metal dividing us. "And my son future does not have room for you. He is going to grow up knowing what real love looks like. He is going to grow up in a home where he is valued for exactly who he is, not what he can buy. You will never set foot on this property. You will never speak to him again. You will not infect his life with your toxic, parasitic desperation." "But I am your mother," Vivian wailed, dropping to her knees on the asphalt. She reached one hand through the bars, blindly grasping at the empty air between us. "You owe me. I gave you life. You cannot let me die in the street." I looked down at her. There was no pity in my heart. There was no lingering childhood desire for her approval. The emotional chains she had wrapped around my neck for 35 years were completely, irrevocably shattered. I felt nothing but a profound, liberating emptiness. "I owe you absolutely nothing," I replied. I took a deliberate step backward out of her reach. I turned my head toward the security booth and caught Marcus' eye. He was already standing by the control panel, his posture rigid and professional. "Marcus," I called out, my tone entirely conversational. "Escort this woman off the property. If she refuses to leave the perimeter, or if she ever returns to this gate, call the local authorities and press charges for trespassing." "Yes, Ms. Davis," Marcus replied, instantly, stepping out of the booth. Jada Vivian screamed. It was a guttural, animalistic sound of pure defeat. "Jada, please. Come back here. Do not walk away from me." I turned my back on her. I did not hesitate. I did not look over my shoulder. I walked slowly and deliberately up the long, tree-lined driveway of my estate. Behind me, the heavy iron gates let out a deep, mechanical hum as they engaged their security locks. Vivian, hysterical cries faded into the crisp morning air, drowned out by the rustling of the oak leaves and the steady, peaceful rhythm of my own footsteps. The chapter was closed. The book was burned. The months that followed were a revelation. Stripped of the constant draining presence of my toxic relatives, my life blossomed into something beautiful and profoundly quiet. There were no more passive-aggressive phone calls. There were no more agonizing family dinners where I had to swallow my pride and endure their mockery. There was just peace, pure, uninterrupted peace. Trey transformed. Removed from the shadow of his grandmother's disdain and his uncle's overwhelming arrogance, my son began to thrive in ways that brought tears to my eyes. He was no longer the anxious, quiet boy trying to make himself small to avoid criticism. I enrolled him in an advanced, highly competitive arts program in the city. His instructors immediately recognized his talent. He started bringing home massive canvases bursting with color and life. He laughed louder. He stood taller. His confidence soared. He finally understood that he did not have to earn his right to exist. He was already enough. My business empire expanded exponentially. Taking over Atlas Freight and liquidating Sentinel Capital, remaining viable assets, solidified my reputation in the financial sector. I was no longer the warehouse manager they loved to mock. I was a recognized corporate titan. But unlike Jamal, I built my wealth on transparency, grueling hard work, and unshakable integrity. I started a mentorship program for young underprivileged entrepreneurs, teaching them how to build sustainable businesses without sacrificing their souls. I was creating a legacy that Trey could actually be proud of. Every evening as I sat on my back patio, watching Trey sketch the sunset over our private lake, I reflected on the agonizing journey it took to get here. Society conditions us to believe that blood is an unbreakable bond. We are taught to forgive the unforgivable simply because the person hurting us shares our DNA. But blood does not make a family. Respect makes a family. Loyalty makes a family. Unconditional love makes a family. My parents and my brother had demanded my loyalty while offering me nothing but contempt in return. They had expected me to be the perpetual stepping stone for their grand ambitions. But I had refused to crumble. I had taken their rejection, their embezzlement, and their sheer cruelty, and I had weaponized it. I had used the very stones they threw at me to build an impenetrable fortress for myself and my son. Sometimes the only way to heal from a toxic family is to burn their illusions to the ground and build your peace on the ashes. Have you ever had to cut off a golden child or a toxic parent to protect your peace? Tell me your story in the comments. And if you believe that true success is the best revenge, hit that like and subscribe button. I will see you in the next video. The most powerful lesson here is that blood does not obligate you to endure abuse. Society often pressures us to forgive toxic family members simply because we share DNA. However, true family is built on mutual respect, loyalty, and unconditional love, not manipulation and exploitation. You do not have to set yourself on fire to keep toxic people warm. Establishing ironclad boundaries and walking away from those who constantly diminish your worth is the ultimate act of self-care. True peace and success come from protecting your space and building a life grounded in integrity rather than seeking validation from those who only use you. If you've ever had to cut ties with toxic relatives to protect your own well-being, share your story in the comments below and hit subscribe for more empowering content.